There we go. Got the music down there. Can't hear myself with that wonderful soundtrack from Mr. Mark Pilkington. I don't have time to read a lot of contemporary literature for various reasons. I used to read a lot more, and I'm just mostly a nonfiction hound and love the classics. But through sort of somewhat random circumstances, I found myself holding a Rachel Nagelberg, who I had the opportunity to meet a year or so ago, and it's called The Fifth Wall, and it actually intrigued me greatly. It's a very intelligently written, well-crafted book. It's the kind of thing that the literary scene would love. Reflective, somewhat anxious, somewhat bleak, often beautiful in concept and in execution. But I was particularly intrigued with it because Rachel, though she lives in Los Angeles now, lived in San Francisco, and there's a lot of sort of greasy thumbprints of San Francisco issues on it, which in many ways are reflected in the kinds of things I like to talk about in the show. There's themes of technology, of the San Francisco underground, of ayahuasca, healing circles, and also just a very recognizable zone of a younger generation in the city than mine. Rachel's about 30. And so it was really, for me, quite an eye-opening read of a place that was very familiar, but from a very different angle. The story is about an artist who does sort of documentary artwork using video and found objects and installations, named Sheila Ackerman. And we start off with this incredibly traumatic event where Sheila witnesses the suicide of her mother almost spontaneously. She just sort of walks in. Her mom had a tumor, and this sort of trauma sets in motion a lot of the searching and the anxiety and the despair and some of the even some of the exuberant explorations that the rest of the book follows as we meet robotic artists and various boyfriends and go on certain adventures that, again, are sort of recognizably Bay Area in a lot of ways. So I was really intrigued by the book, and even though I don't often have contemporary authors on the show, I usually think about literature as sort of a different zone, and this is definitely not the kind of genre book that I usually read. It has science fictional elements, but it's more sophisticated in tone than most science fiction, certainly in writing style. So I thought I'd bring Rachel on the show and talk to her about that, about her own experiences. It's good to get younger voices on the show as well. I know for young people, a 30-year-old maybe sounds old, but for me, it's a whole other world, and it fascinates me to see how people are dealing with the issues of transforming technology, of surveillance, of, Instagram, cell phones, all that stuff, and how that kind of it makes it difficult in a way to write novels. I think a lot of novels are sort of struggling to figure out what they are about, what they mean, what they can do in our contemporary, increasingly surreal and desperate environment where the very form of the story seems to be, of the personal story especially, seems extremely difficult to get. I think a lot of us maybe once had more of a sense that our lives were unfolding as narratives, and now they feel more like quick takes with a lot of commercial interruptions and changing of channels. So that frustrates some of the traditional functions of narrative. So it was wonderful to see it worked out in what, to my mind, was a very successful novel, especially given that it's a first novel. So anyway, Rachel, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I love the show.
Great. We were talking about how to start off the conversation, and one thing, of course, is what motivated you to write this book? Some boring version of that, but of course, what's more interesting is to sort of get a sense of how, once you started with whatever principles you had, whatever themes you were interested in, how it drifted. Because clearly, for me, reading this book, part of what I enjoyed about it is I could tell that you were working out a lot of things. You were working out your own shit. You were working out issues of being in San Francisco and kind of seeing that a little bit in the rearview mirror. and not in a way that it's just overly confessional, but just the sense that the stories and the incidents and the language was really processing a lot of material. So it felt like I was with you kind of in the creative process. So I'm kind of curious how, from your end, how did the book drift once you started actually writing it?
Yeah, so this book actually began in Pittsburgh, actually like the pre-thinking of the book when I did my undergraduate degree there and took a bunch of writing classes. And I was thinking about like where the first real idea for the book came, because originally the book was called The Baby Without a Face, which is a really bizarre title for this book because it has nothing to do with how it came out. But I was really interested in art and science. My kind of focus was on writing, but I did this kind of minor that I created on contemporary studies with art and philosophy. And right at the time when I was doing all this work, the Bodies exhibit was happening at the Carnegie Museum of Science. Do you remember that exhibit?
I do. I saw that in Los Angeles. It was a fascinating experience.
Really fascinating. I actually didn't see it because I was too frightened at the time. I was 20 years old and I was like, I don't know if I could handle this.
Do you want to tell people what it is for those who don't know?
So it was this science exhibit that mounted these bodies that had real human bodies that were deceased, with questionable sources as to where they came from. But they were mounted in all sorts of positions that revealed, right, like the inner workings of the kind of the system, right?
Yeah, and it was very weird because it was like under the framework of science, you were allowed to go in and have this kind of encounter with your own flesh, and it was really amazing experience. Not so much for the bodies themselves, which were impressive, and there were some. It was also, like you say, kind of questionable. It was kind of like exploitation under the sign of science. But watching other people react to it was incredible. But it freaked you out too much to go.
It did, and I was also really interested in the idea of how it was presented as an art exhibition as well. And I was kind of exploring these ideas of what are the boundaries today between art and science and art and technology, and kind of to get back to the idea of what inspired the book. When I was younger, I remember distinctly, like, because I started using the internet when I was very young, and, I had a screen name, in my early teens. So I remember walking outside and thinking, like, I can't tell the difference between the inside and the outside. And I didn't really know what that meant at the time, but I felt like something like in my perception was distinctly changing. And so the whole Bodies exhibit kind of brought that idea to me, and trying to explore like this body being presented as this representation in art. And so the book kind of started at that point. But then moving to San Francisco, it changed a lot. Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what I like about the book, is that I can tell that you are a very well-educated East Coast person with a name like Rachel Nagelberg, and yet you slam into San Francisco, and it kind of transforms these issues that you were already developing that come from outside, and then they just get mutated and as they kind of meet the hyper technological hipster sort of drug underground weirdo culture of San Francisco, and so it makes sense that it would change over time. Was writing it kind of almost a way for you to like encounter the place, like a way of finding your own feet in a new environment?
I think it was that, and it was really coming to terms with facing myself as who I was, and all of the work that I still needed to do on myself. Because, I had all of these intellectual ideas about art, about the body, about, the fantasy and reality mixing when I was in Pittsburgh. And then I moved to San Francisco, and I realized as these traumatic events kind of happened in my own life, that I have been sick since I've been a little child. Like, why is the sickness happening? What is going on in the own narrative of my life that is mixing with all these intellectual ideas? And once the intellect begins to fail at healing the body, and it actually becomes almost this tool that disrupts the body and is actually hurting it, like, what happens then? And so I went on this whole healing journey to figure out how to establish free communication with my own system. And I think that really, I had to learn a lot of those things to really open up the book and to bring it these new perspectives.
Well, that's a really a fascinating point. I'd like to stay on that for a little bit, just in terms of, I mean, I think probably if there was one thing that the book was about, it's about trauma. And trauma to me is a very fascinating zone right now in our culture. It's like we're coming to terms with what it means, but also redefining it in ways that are both encourage and open up people's own transformation as they deal with their own personal traumas and collective traumas, although we hear a little bit less about that. And at the same time, it's also becoming a new way for people to create new identities, to understand themselves as being traumatized, and there's also kind of a creep in the term as well, like as it moves beyond, hardcore PTSD or long suffering, physical issues like you had, where it's this recurrent kind of ongoing, confusing problem. It's not like it's just a discrete disease or issue. It's like a larger kind of systemic. Those things, that's trauma. But then it's also something that's kind of shifting and moving, and relative, to my mind, relatively minor emotional problems become reconceived as trauma. So it seems like you're really riding a certain very, in your personal life, you were also kind of moving in a direction that that society as a whole was also kind of wrestling with. And I'm curious to hear how it was that you came to recognize that the existing ways you were trying to treat your issues were not going to work, and that your intellect was kind of getting in the way. And then what do you do? How did you start to explore, given all the range of alternative therapies and different, healing paradigms and all, the whole, cornucopia of alternative medicine? How did you kind of find your own way to recognizing it as a physical, emotional process of change?
Right. That is a loaded question, but I'll do my best to answer. So even before I really knew about the concept of trauma in relation to myself, I kind of called my depression the lack, which ended up in the fifth wall. And kind of like this overwhelming feeling that there was something missing in life, and that would erupt this anxiety attack, like a very existential, but also like just consuming my entire perception. And I also dealt with some autoimmune issues since I was younger, and I've had a neurological disorder. I've had various things where my body has responded to stress in ways that were kind of beyond my control and beyond a lot of doctors' control. And I think when I was stable for a while with Western medicine when moving to San Francisco, and then I kind of got myself into a series of experiences, particularly with men, that I think led me to really, I guess, question what I was doing, and my body started to react in other very bizarre ways. And I think with all of the tools in San Francisco to offer alternative care, just being part of the community, I was led in the Mission District, where I worked for many years, to a community acupuncture clinic where I had never heard about acupuncture or herbs before. And I think it might have been recommended to me by someone at a coffee shop. I don't remember that part. But I recall walking in and saying, I don't know what to do anymore, but I think that I was told to come here and this feels right and let's try something. And from there, I kind of met one of my healers that I'm still very close with today, who kind of like took me under his wing a little bit, and that was my first kind of integration into the alternative care scene.
It's a real funny thing, because I think that, I mean, there's aspects of your story that resonate with mine. I didn't have those sorts of physical issues, but I had pretty, not continuous, but rather severe depression, and with some anxiety thrown in for the mix since college. And I remember very clearly, like my sort of step away from that. I never went on meds, but was meeting an older guy who became kind of a mentor in a way, who had been an anarchist in the 60s, and then, had gone through the drug scene, and then had come into the new age scene and done a lot of physical practices, and a real intellectual guy. So there was no sense that like I had to give up my mind when I went into this world, because he was a model of how you could be a critical intellectual and someone who was, really devoted to spiritual practice and healthy eating and stuff. And I was just really lucky. I just learned a lot of things from him, just about how to be, or, like how to cook and just treat my body, and, to encourage a physical practice. So even if you like say, well, what are the value of any given alternative medicine route, acupuncture, Ayurveda, whatever, there's also something that happens that when you're not doing Western medicine, where you have to take some responsibility for it as a whole life practice. And it, in my case, in so many cases, it really makes it different, but you have to check your brain at the door. That was something I had to learn too.
Yeah, I recall during that time, because between the East and West Coast mentalities, I came from this place where it was like you intellectualize your feelings and you logically think it out. And here in San Francisco, I start to learn terms like feel into your body, feel what's right. And I remember confronting that the first time and being like, how do I even process that? What does it mean to feel this thought? Like, how does thinking come into this? And I ended up, because I'm such a researcher, I researched all these modalities and started to, I'm going to do this meditation retreat, and I'm going to take this like mindfulness course. And I took this mindfulness and trauma course, and that's where I first came across the idea of like the reptilian brain versus the neocortex, and how in trauma, your basically unconscious fight or flight response is continuously activated. So learning about that and learning to kind of feel into this inner anxiety was very transformative at first. And I think that's when I started to learn the language of feeling into the body and feeling what my body was trying to tell me, is when I started to really form this dialogue around my sickness as being this inner messenger. And so that works its way into the fifth wall too, and kind of parallels with this invisible communication that also parallels with technology and our ways to invisibly communicate with.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great connection. And another one is to art. I just was hanging out last night. I did a talk at the Roxy about hippie religion, and it was super fun. There were tons of people there. And I went afterwards, I went out and hung out with John Law, who was a wonderful character, artist, provocateur, who was one of the core people who started Burning Man, or took Burning Man to the playa in the early years of Burning Man, and then he left very early on because it was getting too ridiculous for him. But he's been part of like San Francisco art prankster scene forever, since the 70s. And one of the things he said about what made San Francisco unique in terms of its art, in terms of what people were doing or able to do with thinking about survival research labs or the Suicide Club or early Burning Man or whatever, is that people came, it was cheap, so a lot of people could come here. But because of the culture of the place, because it was California and because of the hippie thing, there was an openness for weirdos and inventors and crazy people, but there was also a relative lack of intellectual, critical people. So it's like in the East Coast and in Europe, if you're in some kind of weird underground avant-garde scene, there's all these intellectuals around who are extremely critical and like hitting everything hard and, bam, 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 bam. And, that's great too. I mean, it's, Dada, it comes out of that kind of world. But San Francisco was a little different. There weren't as many of those people. There weren't professionals as much. There weren't as many like hardcore intellectuals in the scene. I mean, there were a lot of smart people, but they weren't like critical intellectuals in the same kind of way. And he said, look, that just made it open for just more things to happen. And so it's not just in the alternative healing thing with the kind of encouragement to feel your way rather than think. There's also an element of that in the technology and in the art scene as well.
Right. It's interesting because on the East Coast, I love to read so much philosophy and critical theory about kind of the idea of art and reality mixing and contemporary theater and kind of just, I loved the ideas behind the San Francisco art scene. And then when I got there, I felt so much resistance being kind of in the scene and going to these events and feeling like that there was something missing being there because there was no discourse. And like, I found myself questioning a lot, what does it mean to actually be in the show? And like, how does that differ from being outside of it and trying to form conversations around it?
Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, that's been, part of my whole story is also like, it was a really big deal the first time having gone to Burning Man for many years. And then the first year where I chose to give a talk at Burning Man, and so it was the first year they started having talks on the playa, and now they have them all the time. Lots of people, but it was this for me, very profound moment where I was like bringing in my interest in discourse and my, whatever intellectual resources and feeding it back to something that up to that point, at least in my life, had been almost pointedly non-discursive. It was just a place where I lose myself. I didn't pay attention. I didn't take notes. I didn't care. I just had fun. And it was a real interesting moment because it's been something that's brought me both inside and outside of a lot of the things that have gone on here but I respect that. And I'm comfortable around scenes where people aren't interested in discourse. I like it, actually. It kind of rubs against my own tendencies. So, and this is all stuff that is mobilized in your book. I mean, it's like even talking to you, I'm getting more and more sense of why I like the book because the way that it's weaving these different positions together and being very, vulnerable and intense about it too. It's not a cool, distant book by any means, but it has that kind of intellectual clarity to it as well. Anyway, you mentioned the technology side of it, and that's a whole, theme in your book. There's Sheila works at the San Francisco MoMA, the art museum, and there's the show that's being put on by this, robot artist who's doing this, the last art show. And I think, and we talked about doing maybe a reading from the book. So can you read that, the description that the artist offers for the last art, and then the way in which Sheila responds to this art piece?
Sure, yeah. So it's kind of like a comprehensive show called The Last Art, and the artist is just one of the main installations in the show. And so kind of towards the beginning of the book, we get a little description of the show Tacked to a Wall, which is the following. The Last Art presents an interactive venue to experience innovative technology as works of contemporary art. What is the direction that art is moving in? What kind of historical period do we find ourselves in now that we've historicized everything up to the present moment? With the flooding advent of new technologies that allow users to archive life as it's happening, we find that contemporary art is becoming a way of archiving the present. The idea that not only contemporary artists are archivists, but also all who use technology, for we are constantly recording life as it's happening. Everything is happening live. From handheld recording devices and GPS systems to virtual reality interfaces, self-driving cars, biotechnological animal protein growth, and mechanized organs, we have entered into a period where we no longer need bodies to move or eyes to see. Now that the boundaries between art, science, and technology are becoming ever blurred in their attempts to imagine new possibilities for the future, what will the era of the post-human have in store for us and for art? What will the role of art take on?
Yeah, so that really sets up some of the kind of big, the big think themes that you play out in really interesting ways in the book. Just to throw in one example before we hear Sheila's response to the artworks. Later on, there's a brief bit where a woman wearing Google Glass goes into a hipster bar in the Haight, or the Lower Haight, and some drunk hipster wants to take off the glasses and ends up beating her. And it's this, and then the clip goes viral, and then we have this whole kind of event, and we're becoming incredibly familiar with these things very rapidly. How much we've sort of like, okay, that's just part of reality, where you get these, what would be in a science fiction novel written 20 years ago, these extremely bizarre, weird, like, could that ever happen kind of moments. And, yet we experience that kind of thing all the time and also that problem of distance, of like, how, if we're trying to inhabit our lives more fully, and at the same time, all these tools we have almost necessarily place us in a kind of distance role, or a role of archivist, where we're kind of modulating or commenting on our own experience, and then how does art intervene with that whole issue? It's really really big questions, and Sheila has her own kind of response to that stuff as well.
Yeah, a little bit later in the book, she is talking to an old professor, and she's kind of pondering this. She says, "I think of all the technology being installed for the last art. Screens projecting 3D interfaces of computed data of city structures mirroring coral reef patterns, the inner workings of the internet resembling dark matter and the biological structure of the brain. All of it raw data translated to moving colored lines, shifting like ghosts in a digitalized non-place. The display of smart art weaponry, the world's first laser-guided bomb, plus current laser and satellite-guided bombs. A GPS bomb, a 3D printed AR-15, artificial hearts and lean slabs of beef growing in petri dishes, a film about the world's first artificial organism, a whole room filled with thousands of mounted smartphones displaying viral YouTube videos, Instagram and Facebook posts, text and picture messages. Everything is happening now in a way that feels self-generating, and yet it's all actually outside of us. Information circling around us at a rate faster than time, producing total disorientation, amnesia, panic. We talk about the world as if we have a clear concept of what it is, its satellite image as familiar to us as a photograph of our friends, but we actually have no fucking clue. Technology has been able to make the Earth feel completely known, one big illusion we've all grown accustomed to."
Indeed, that's some big stuff. I mean, how do you? I mean, after going through the issues in the book, writing about the book, and doing being an artist as well as a writer yourself, how do you think art intervenes in that? Because when I hear that, and when I think about shows I've been to that are doing something similar, and I used to go to a lot of new media conferences in the 90s and the early 2000s. So this this has been going on for couple decades now. And I often have the sense, like, on the one hand, sometimes I get a sense of a really artistic intervention in this problem. But then equally, if not more, I get the sense that the artist is somewhat passively simply recoding a flow that's already coming in from some other world in a way that doesn't necessarily tell us very much. Like you talk there at the beginning about, like, oh, look, you can look at the internet and you can map it onto the human brain. There's a lot of like digital art or media art. It's just taking an existing information flow and then translating it into another form, and then saying that other form is like the art. And it's like, okay, but isn't that what we're doing anyway? I mean, it's almost like capitulating to a process rather than making an intervention or a reframing or some other idea of what art might do. So what do you think? I mean, how does art intervene in this situation, which you described both emotionally and conceptually very well? What is the role of the artist to do something other than simply spread the anxious overflow?
Well, I think that it can be a really important role of the artist to reveal these invisible systems at work and present them to us in new ways that actually showcase a truth underlying the surface. And there are a lot of really great artists that do that. Actually, one of my favorite video artists, Ryan Tricarton, have you heard of him?
No.
He is, oh my gosh, he blows me away, but he makes these elaborate videos that kind of cut and paste this extreme montage sequences of like almost very critically and violently written dialogues about technology, about kind of American reality TV with characters that are completely mediated through different modes of filters and like voiceovers. And it's just kind of like, it feels like you're watching the end of the internet, the end of television, but doing it in such like an extreme way that you're presented with like this new image of seeing it where you're outside of it. And I really think it can be so emotionally impactful to view something like that. And I really think novels too. I know you're talking about like before what is the role of the novel today, and it is to create an emotional connection that allows people to really identify with the underlying invisible systems and kind of and reveal it in new ways.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I found your novel affecting was because of the emotional content, and in a way, you could say that we're experiencing this science fictional onslaught of information and all these transformations that you've mentioned in the quotations that you read, and in a way, that world, the kind of like game that we're in is that. You got to feel like you're up for it. Like you're going to make, you can add your own, you can make sense of it, you can make decisions within it, you can show up, whether we think about that in terms of being an entrepreneur or how you craft your online persona and how you promote yourself and how you like show up for that world. And some people seem to be able to do it well without too much cost, emotional and otherwise. But I think a lot of us, certainly myself, find it extremely taxing. And then on the downside, you feel disconnected, anxious, amnesiac, traumatized in some sense. I mean, to use the term loosely, we are all, subjects of these transformations that are continually, just even from the endless series of upgrades that you have to kind of handle, and you're just used to using something. I mean, that even something as trivial as that begins to feel aggressive, even like a certain kind of violence that we're constantly experiencing in order to still be part of the social world. But the downside, again, is these feelings of alienation, of depression, of anxiety, all this kind of thing, but you don't know what to do with them. And I often feel like it's like I'm very isolated, like, oh, I can't hack it. I'm not, showing up and being like the new post-human person who can handle this world. But of course, millions and millions of people are feeling this way. And it's not always easy to figure out how to really connect with those feelings so that at the very least you don't feel alone, but also so you begin to understand ways of hacking the situation. So I think you're right that the novel has because of the intimacy that the novel provides in terms of interiority and all of the intellectual material that can go in there as well, it provides a way of navigating that something like film and video or TV can't do at all. So that makes sense.
And there's also this cool idea of like, when you're reading a novel, you are confronted with yourself, but you also lose yourself in a different sense than you would necessarily going to an art show or, watching I guess watching a film is a really great way to do that as well. But the fifth wall, just the title really deals with that idea is that, technology moving beyond the idea of the fourth wall, which is an old theater term, which is the invisible wall between the audience and stage. And now with this realm of technology and with this kind of these profiles and this social media where, even when you're having a conversation with somebody on the computer, you're able to watch yourself. And like, what does it mean to feel like to be and to perceive in a world where you are now outside of yourself being viewed by yourself. The ego is completely different now, and that does produce so much anxiety.
Yeah, that's a weird one. I remember, having conversations with people when you do, certain kinds of video calls where you have the little window of you. And, and I was like, and I don't like to look at myself. Like I only use a mirror at the bare minimum. I'm not particularly interested in collecting photographs of myself. It's not something that really is very interesting to me. And so I would normally think that I wouldn't look at that, like I look at the person that I'm having the video conference with. And yet, again and again and again, I realize that I'm looking at myself, and it's such a weird, alienating, but kind of fascinating phenomenon. Like, what is that attraction that's talking to other people? And they're like, oh yeah, everybody does that. You're always looking at yourself. And it's like a strange divide, because who would have thought that? People have been talking about, the video phone, they've been imagining that for, for a century. And, it's actually one of the few like classic old school science fiction futurism items that we've actually gotten. We didn't get the flying car and, whatever. There's a lot of stuff we didn't get, but we got the video phone. And it's funny that like our self intrudes in that process in a way that it doesn't on a phone or in face-to-face meeting, obviously. And I wonder about that. What do you think is that what's happening to the self under these situations?
I'm still trying to figure that one out. But so far, it doesn't feel like it's very constructive.
To say the least. It's like this kind of, what does narcissism mean? Like, narcissism is a certain kind of, I don't know, it's a word. It's been, used a lot in social criticism. I do a lot of work on the 70s, and it's the narcissistic decade where everybody's navel gazing and interested in themselves. And even this language of trauma and healing and your healing journey and all that stuff can be seen from that point of view as kind of this deepening of narcissism. And certainly if you look at like the kind of contemporary yoga world and how that has been remediated, and all the yoga teachers who Instagram pictures of themselves in front of exotic mystical buildings and whatever, it just, in a way, there is this kind of certain increasing intensity of attention to the self, with the selfie stick obviously being the sort of obvious technology of it. But to my mind, narcissism as a concept doesn't quite get at it either, because I don't know, it's just there's something else that's going on with like the self, as if it's almost like the last point that is yet to be completely interpolated into all of these technological systems of flows. And so everybody, not just human beings, but also the technology, the machines, the internet, everybody's trying to figure out, like, what is the self? Is it there? Is it real? Is it just a bunch of, algorithms in our head? Does it have a narrative? Can it know itself? It's like the whole thing is trying to figure out what is the self.
Right. And there's this kind of like paradox that happens, that while we began creating this image of ourselves to project on to something else, now we're kind of identifying ourselves by the image and using that to define us back. And like, what happens when we do that?
Yeah, I can only imagine that it's dizzying. And how much do these issues play out in at least in the novel, in terms of the kinds of relationships Sheila has? That's one of the bigger themes, is a series of men, to my mind, of varying qualities, some quite callow that she's drawn to nonetheless, some that seem a little more grounded and sweet, but also doesn't really work out. So there's some way in which this problem of the self, I can't even imagine trying to date in the Tinder world. I can't, I'm 50. I can't even begin to wrap my head around it. I think I would be celibate in this world. It's just, I can't, I don't go there. I'm too old for that. But anyway, how much do you think these issues play out in relationships? And is that part of the reason that relationships are so central to the narrative?
Well, luckily I haven't yet had to try Tinder, but I think that, I think that the relationships more deal with the idea of image in general, and Sheila is drawn to these men who immediately project an image onto her that she assumes. So it's almost like this way of her not having to really confront herself by having to play these roles, and like what happens to her when she goes down the route and she ends up having, does she end up having to face herself after that?
Yeah, that kind of reminds me a little bit of the other passage we talked about. As you put it, in some ways, kind of a culminating passage of the book, a couple of pages. But I think it really hits on a lot of the themes we've been talking about. So maybe you could read that.
Yeah, sure. Let's go there. Right. So this is a little ways into the book, and Sheila kind of has these little insights, poetic insights, and this is one of them. Artists act and make choices. They live and make responses. They absorb the stimuli surrounding them. They don't justify anything. People grow up with a unique set of references, learn belief systems, complex combinations of energies. We form images in our minds about what's right and what's wrong and the possibilities in the gray area in between. Inconsistency with our own processes is important. It allows us to continue to live, to respond. The second we stop responding, we die. In San Francisco, when the wind blows harshly, it forces one to ask why it feels like the earth is punishing. Is it the shifting tectonic forces, the dissolving of the ozone, the culminating grief in lost bodies thrashing through the streets? There are coincidences and there are consequences. The difference depends on the preparation, the acknowledged foresight, the feeling that what is to come might very well be a whole lot worse. Or perhaps it has already been this bad, but it's a horror that's become so familiar that you no longer see it. When then does the trauma begin, and where and when can it end? For years I've been searching the male body as if there is something to find inside of it, some tangible mass, some undiscovered organ, the magic rib from whence Eve became cloned. This is now the bones of my flesh and my flesh. We go through motions, patterns. We make decisions about how to live. To tell the truth, I've always felt as if I've been living in false positions, subsisting without contour. Perhaps that's why I'm drawn to obliteration, a false embodiment, all-consuming, but exceedingly short-lasting, never amounting to anything tangible. But these days I feel a constant inner restlessness, as if I'm a hollowed tree, surrounded by nocturnal animals that are foraging discarded objects and storing them inside of me. I feel born of a great absence. The air in my body feels strange. There's a constant feeling that something's missing, but what is too vague to really be sure? To spend one's whole life searching for something elusive, something, anything to cling to. Perhaps that's when the body makes its decision to create. The tumor, the lax, the tinnitus, all born from an absence, from a deep assembling rage. Caleb says he can feel depression deep inside his DNA, has seen visions of himself in the womb enveloped in dark, writhing energy, has felt the sadness of the cavernous body housing him, and how he fed on that sadness, her sadness, the only world he knew. There are studies about mitochondria and the passing trauma from a mother to her child, how a body forms within a learned nervous system, the gut, the second brain of the human body that for some reason we've devolved in this country to neglect. Isn't the body's main job to store things? Performance artists believe that if you can push the body to its limit without dying, that death is no longer an inevitability, but an eventual consequence. I've never wished for such control, and yet I've created my own ruin. It was an appallingly horrific coincidence. I walked in the doorway, and there she was. I never wanted to step foot in that house again. Just knowing it was there made me so anxious I could hardly breathe. If I'm a terrorist, then I should want something. I should want death and destruction, to induce fear in others, to brutally fight, to die for what I believe in. But I don't really believe in anything, and I don't want to die. I used to think I wanted to, even as a little girl. I watched Peter Pan and I cried. I couldn't control the muscles in my face, my trembling body. to never grow old, to watch the world age around you. For a week I wet the fucking bed. Pan, which is ironically the root of panic, to be consumed by it all. I have this feeling deep inside me, this rush to get up and lunge at a great distance and purge myself of something that's not physically in my stomach or intestines, but somewhere lurking in my brain. The scariest part of it, knowing that this feeling has been with me all along. This emptiness, this dread, this lack spreading amongst my insides, throughout my veins and arteries, my organic flowing system, all around me and inside of me, like a desert swallowing me whole and each day spitting out a copy of myself. The fear that this is all that there is and it's all that there will ever be. Your life will never reach a certain point. The point keeps receding like a moving landscape, disappearing into the distance, and you're always on the way. All of history feels like it's culminating onto the moving image of her body, her face a pixelation of tiny moving pieces, black hole and white wall, screen and camera, always expanding, repeating, playing forever into madness. We can't turn back and we can never unsee. This is something we have to live with. The camera's still recording.
Yeah, indeed. That's quite a howl, if you will, of our current plight. I mean, a lot of it really resonates with me. I thought that thing about Pan is very interesting, because in some ways it's, we're such a technological environment, so far away from the world, the sylvan groves associated with the god Pan, and yet the whole connection of the all, of the everything, and the panic within that everything also seems really, really part of the picture. And that's something, when you think about those emotions that are stirred up by our contemporary experience, the feeling of, in my taste in particularly, dread, panic, paranoia, and kind of exhaustion, this sort of larger despair not for just the personal self, but for the situation. I mean, these are like profoundly deep, ancient, almost sacred forces. I mean, they're incredibly challenging to deal with, but they're not superficial. And in some ways, it feels like, to maintain our humanity or extend our humanity or whatever you want to call it, to keep the artistic part of ourselves alive, we have to, accept and even embrace some of that, because it's the only ballast we have. Otherwise, we're lost in that world that the artist Ryan is kind of depicting. We're just sort of figures, superficial, postmodern, reframed digital blips. And I mean, this, it's hard, because you have to, what is the dark side you have to try to heal, and what is the dark side you have to kind of embrace and work with. But it feels like your work is getting to that edge, and the kind of necessity of some of these feelings, even though they can be, so painful and debilitating.
Right. I think my healing work, where it ended up leading me in between the years, I kind of took a little break between writing the book, is I kind of realized that I had to really look inward, that I can't keep, moving to a new place or getting a new job or trying to kind of focus on the outside. It's really about going and journeying on the inside and seeing what's going on. And that's where my work kind of led me to Peru and to working with ayahuasca and actually going deep into the kind of communication with the depression in my DNA, and kind of like the brother that Sheila has in this book, who is in Peru at the time, and he's doing these medicinal journeys, kind of realizing that these feelings come from a much more complex and larger place than just myself, and what that means, and how do I work on balancing the healing, but also keeping the darkness that allows me to transform that into art.
Yeah, that's really wonderfully said. It's funny. It reminds me of an insight I also had in an ayahuasca session, where I simultaneously was able to see kind of the personal roots of some of my depression or some of my whatever own psychological problems, but simultaneously those issues were linked to the totality of human experience. It's like, okay, to boil it down too simply, it's like, okay, yeah, I had these issues with my father, but my father had these things with his father, and his father had these things with his father, and all that is true. I know that. But then it goes back, it goes back, it goes back, it goes all the way back, and you realize that it's everything. And so it's like you're simultaneously given the tools to work with your specific problems to some degree, and at the same time recognize that it's part of this much larger collective thing that's just woven into the picture. It's just part of the tapestry, and it's actually something that can be useful, that fuels and doesn't just hurt. Caleb, you mentioned how he's the character who's down in the jungle, drinking the brew, and we don't hear that much from him, but I'm kind of curious, like how you wanted to weave in the sort of ayahuasca healing zone into your story, and do you see it as connected to some of these artistic questions or technological questions? How for you was it important to figure the kind of ayahuasca story into yours?
Yeah, I really wanted to just kind of put like a little hint in there, maybe towards a hint towards my next works, but I wanted to kind of have a contrast to all of this intellectualization and like kind of present this way of this medicine as a deconditioning from the sickness that, media. And what happens when we do surrender to this mind-body intelligence, and the insights that Caleb has kind of contrasting with Sheila's insights, I think really creates a really powerful emotive sense of the book. And also at the time I was really just starting to really touch on these things within myself, and it just felt really important. And to kind of bring it back to what you were saying before about this trauma discourse that's going on, and kind of pinpointing exactly what's the reason behind all of your issues and whatnot. And really it's interesting because for me, there's not a single event that I can say, this is where my trauma started, this is where I fix it. It's more like you were saying, this whole encompassing human experience. And when confronting that with ayahuasca, it brought me into that kind of place, this landscape where it broke down the boundaries between my body and the earth and allowed me to explore kind of this whole narration of story and origins. And I'm still working with these ideas really about what does healing mean in that sense, where it's like there is no, one antidote for this one issue. What does it mean to heal? And I think Caleb's really trying to present this to Sheila from this, he does it in the form of text messages, so you don't really get any description of where he is and what he's doing besides what he's telling her.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're going to maybe, continue to work in that direction, because, again, I think that your perspective and your history and your intellect and the way you think about art really allows, again, some intelligent discourse to go around something that is too easily kind of, I don't want to say dumbed down, but sort of brought into a certain kind of, grooviness or insider hipster thing, or whatever. It's like I've grown, even as someone who's participated in yoga and meditation and psychedelics and all this very kind of Bay Area world. I've grown weary of the self-indulgence and the let's say narcissism of it. And your approach to these things really, I think is important, and I hope you keep working on it in novels or art in general. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I just want to ask one more little bit on the science. At the very end of the novel, we get to go to the Lost Theater, and it was a very recognizable kind of sort of very creative, but also sort of sleazy San Francisco, Burning Man-esque kind of world that's, like it's this kind of world of wonder, but it's sort of vaguely tawdry. And I'm kind of curious, like, having gone through some of that scene too, or, kind of touched it, how do you feel about that sort of side of the picture, the more, the sort of party, the Dionysian party, the masks, the characters, the whole sort of exuberant play, which is such an intoxicating and fun thing, but also it sometimes seems a little unclear what it serves. Was that part of? I mean, was I right to sense some ambivalence there?
Oh yeah. I think I tried to touch on it a little bit earlier when I was talking about what happens when you're actually part of the show instead of being outside of it. And I think I went to a very similar event of the Lost Theater in San Francisco, and I think I was, well, if I hadn't been on numerous substances that made it very, very enjoyable, I think I would have had a very similar experience to what I normally have at events like that, which is feeling very lost and confronted with my own sense of insecurities, because there's this really loose and really beautiful but very image-based, physical, sexual kind of way of being and celebrating in San Francisco that I had not encountered until moving there. And so my own issues with being inside of my body are really kind of confronted with, like, I feel like I'm just projecting onto everything. So I'm seeing my own insecurities. So it was kind of like a way of bringing that out in the book.
Yeah, well, that I think again it was very well done and quite stimulating, or kind of intriguing, at least from my perspective. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. So what are you working on now? Are you doing another book, or what's your current creative stuff?
I am working on another book idea. It's in the very first stages, and I've been working on a book of poetry, and I have some poems that are published online. You can check them out on my website, and I'm planning on them being in the next book as well, so stay tuned for that.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind, Rachel.
Thanks so much, Erik.
Great. All right, so until next week, to all you out there, keep your minds open.